The engines came before the sun cleared the tree line. That was how people in Calhoun, Georgia would remember it later. Not the sight of them, though. The sight was something none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. What they remembered first was the sound. A low, sustained rumble that seemed to rise up from the earth itself from somewhere beneath the red clay, and the kudzu and the railroad tracks that had been rusting at the edge of town since the mill closed. A sound that built and built until it was not a sound anymore, but a presence, something you felt behind your sternum and in the roots of your back teeth. Darnell Odom was awake before it started. He was always awake before the sun. Not because he had anywhere particular to be, though usually he did. He was 14 years old, and the arithmetic of their life required him to be moving early, to have his contribution made and ready, before the day got away from him. He lay in the dark of his room in the small house on Birch Street and listened to the neighborhood wake up around him. The slow gathering of ordinary morning sounds. A car turning over 2 streets over the Mockingbird that had claimed the telephone pole outside his window and announced its claim every morning with the same aggressive enthusiasm. Then the other sound started. He heard it the way you hear something that doesn't fit the category of things you expect to hear as a wrongness first. A disruption in the pattern before the pattern could identify what was disrupting it. A low note distant like the first hint of weather moving in from the west. Then more notes joining it. Then more until the whole frequency of the morning had changed, and what he was hearing was no longer individual, but collective. No longer a sound, but a tide. He got up. He went to the window and looked out at Birch Street and stood very still for a long moment, because what he saw required stillness before it could be processed. The street was full of motorcycles, not 2 or 3, not a group passing through. Full. As far as he could see in both directions, the street was lined with Harley Davidsons, their chrome catching the early light in long broken flashes, their riders sitting patient and unhurried on their machines, some with engines idling and some with engines off, and all of them looking at the small brown house on Birch Street, as though they had been given an address and had arrived at it and were now simply waiting for whatever came next. Darnell stood at the window and counted to 20 before he stopped counting. Then he went to get his mother. Delma Odom was already awake, already in the kitchen, already doing the things she did in the kitchen before 6 in the morning that had become so routine they no longer required full consciousness to execute. She heard Darnell's footsteps and turned to say something ordinary, something about breakfast or the time, and then she saw his face, and she stopped. She went to the window. She stood beside her son and looked out at the street full of motorcycles and did not say anything for a long time. Delma Odom was a woman who had learned to absorb unexpected things without falling apart in front of her son. Had learned this the way most women in her position learned it, through the slow accumulation of mornings when she was the only steady thing in the room and could not afford to be otherwise. She absorbed this now. The motorcycles, the riders, the sound. Then she said, "Go get dressed." Properly. Darnell went. He came back in the clothes he wore to church, the dark slacks and the blue button shirt that Delma kept pressed and hung on the outside of the closet door for occasions that required them. He was not sure this was that kind of occasion, but something told him it was better to be wrong in the direction of too formal than wrong in the other direction. The knock at the front door came 7 minutes later. 3 knocks, deliberate, not aggressive, not hesitant. The knock of someone who has decided to knock and is doing it. Delma went to the door. Darnell stood slightly behind her, and to the left, the way he had positioned himself since he was small. when strangers came to the door close enough to be present, but not in the way. The woman on the porch was not small. She was built the way certain women are built who have spent decades doing physical things and have arrived at a kind of solidity that is different from simple size. Something structural about it, settled. She was somewhere in her early 50s with dark hair going silver at the temples and arms that were covered from wrist to the edge of her sleeve in tattoos. The images dense and varied. The kind of coverage that told you the work had been done over a long time, and each piece had meant something to the person who chose it. Her jacket was black leather worn to a softness that came from years of use, and on the back of it was the emblem that had filled Birch Street this morning, the name and the image that people in the South either respected or feared or both. She looked at Delma first, then at Darnell. She said, "My name is Joyce Mack. Your son did something for me yesterday. I would like to return the favor if you will allow it." Her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime saying exactly what she meant and had lost patience somewhere along the way for the kind of talk that circled around meaning without landing on it. Delma looked at her. Delma looked at the street behind her. Then she looked back at Joyce Mack and did the thing she always did when she was deciding whether to trust something. She went quiet for a moment in a specific way. Not hesitant, but assessing the same quiet she used before she signed anything or agreed to anything. The quiet of a woman who had been surprised by the world enough times to know that the world's surprises did not always come gift-wrapped. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Joyce Mack came in. She sat at the kitchen table, and she placed a white envelope on the surface, and she did not push it toward anyone, just left it there between them, the way you leave something that belongs to someone else and is waiting to be claimed. She said the envelope contained money. She named the amount in a straightforward way, the way you state a fact, rather than make an offer. And the amount was enough to cover 6 months of the rent on the house on Birch Street and what remained of Darnell's school fees for the year. She said it was not a loan. She said it came with no conditions and no obligations, and she wanted to be absolutely clear about that before Delma touched it. Delma sat across from her and listened, and looked at the envelope and then at Joyce Mack. She said, "My son fixed a flat tire." That is all he did. Joyce Mack said, "Yes, ma'am." That is all he did. She said it in a way that made clear she understood the gap between what had happened and what was now sitting on the kitchen table, and that she was not going to apologize for the gap or try to make it smaller than it was. Some things were what they were. Darnell stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched his mother's face and waited. Delma picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she set it back down and looked at Joyce Mack and said, "Why?" Joyce Mack said, "Because in the world I move through, most people see someone like me coming and they get out of the way. They do not ask if I need something. They assume what I need is space between us. Your boy did not do that. He just saw something that needed fixing and he fixed it. And where I come from, that kind of thing matters more than most people understand." She paused. She said, "We do not forget it. That is all I can tell you." The next 20 minutes had a quality that Darnell would spend years trying to describe to people who had not been there. The dreamlike incongruity of sitting in the small kitchen of the house on Birch Street with the morning light coming through the window above the sink, while outside visible through that window, if you turned your head, 200 Harley-Davidsons lined the street, and the riders stood beside them, or sat on them, or leaned against them with the easy patience of people who had nowhere else to be. The neighbors came out gradually, First, the Wheelers from the house directly across Mr. Wheeler in his bathrobe, standing on the porch with his coffee going cold in his hand, Mrs. Wheeler behind him. Then the Battens from next door. Then more accumulating the way people accumulate at the edge of anything extraordinary drawn by the sound or the sight, or simply by the fact that other people were already there looking. None of the bikers paid them attention. They were simply present. The size and fact of that presence was its own communication. Darnell went back outside at some point, when the conversation at the kitchen table had reached a place of quiet resolution, when his mother had accepted the envelope with the kind of dignity that acknowledged both the gift and the weight of receiving it. He stood on the front porch in his church clothes and looked out at the street. A large man near the front of the formation caught his eye and nodded once. Not a greeting exactly. More like an acknowledgement, one person recognizing another across a distance. Then a car came down Birch Street. It was a town car, dark blue with the official seal of the city of Calhoun on the driver's door. It slowed as it entered the block, and then slowed further. As the driver took in the scene, the motorcycles and riders filling the street. And then it came to a complete stop about 30 feet from the front of the Odom house. The man who got out was wearing a suit despite the hour. He was in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders with the kind of face that had once been handsome, and now had the look of a thing maintained through effort. The jaw still defined, but the eyes having developed over the years a quality of calculation that careful maintenance could not obscure. Mayor Dennis Stoll, Ennis. Darnell had seen him at school events, had seen him on the local news with the frequency of a weather report, had seen his face on the signs that appeared every few years at the edges of town when elections came around. He was the kind of politician that small towns produced with a specific reliability, the kind who wore the town like a costume and performed belonging to it, with the ease of a man who had been performing it so long, he had stopped noticing he was performing. Stoll walked toward Joyce Mack with his hand already extended, the smile arriving before the handshake practiced and warm, in the way of something that had been refined through repetition, until the repetition no longer showed. He said her name, not her full name. A shortened version of it, the version that implied familiarity. Joyce Mack looked at his hand for a moment before she took it. The handshake was brief. Stoll turned to Delma on the porch, and his smile adjusted itself to a different register. Slightly warmer, slightly more concerned, the expression of a public servant, addressing a constituent. He said, "Delma." "Everything all right here," Delma said. "Everything is fine, Dennis." He nodded slowly. His eyes moved to Darnell, and in the second before his expression resettled into its public configuration, there was something in the look that Darnell noticed and filed away without knowing exactly what to do with it yet. Not hostility, not warmth. Something more precise than either. Something that was taking stock. Stoll said, "Fine people, I am sure. Just keeping an eye on things. That is all. You know how I am about this town." He said it to Delma, but his eyes went back to Joyce Mack when he said it. And something passed between those two looks. A communication that had no words and that Darnell was too young to fully decode, but old enough to recognize as the kind of exchange adults made when they knew things about each other that they had decided not to say out loud. Stoll got back in his car. The car moved slowly down Birch Street, navigating between the parked motorcycles, and turned at the corner and was gone. Darnell looked at Joyce Mack. She was watching the corner where Stoll's car had disappeared. She stood very still, the way certain people stand still when they are doing a great deal of thinking. And the stillness was not the stillness of someone who had stopped, but the stillness of someone entirely in motion internally. Then she turned and looked at Darnell. She said, "How long have you lived on this street?" He said, "All my life." She said, "And how long has Dennis Stoll been mayor?" He said, "Since before I was born, nearabout." Joyce Mack nodded. She looked back at the corner. Then she said something that Darnell would not understand fully until much later. Until the pieces that were still assembling themselves had found their final positions. She said long enough to know exactly what he has got, and exactly what he is afraid of losing. Then she excused herself and went to make a phone call. Now, the morning before, the beginning of it. The day had started the way most of Darnell's days started, with the alarm on his phone at 5:45, and the deep darkness of a Georgia summer morning that was already warm at that hour. The air having never fully cooled overnight, carrying the smell of cut grass and red clay and the distant sweetness of the kudzu that crept over everything at the edges of town if you let your attention slip for a season. He had his route. Agnes Whitfield ran the only independent grocery store left in Calhoun, a fact she mentioned with the regularity of someone who considered it a civic duty to be documented. Whitfield's General had been on the corner of Main and Calvary since Agnes's father opened it in 1961, and it had survived the arrival of 2 different chain stores in the past 30 years. Through the combination of Agnes's stubbornness and the loyalty of customers who remembered when there had been nothing else, and had developed the habit of loyalty before they had the option of choosing differently. Darnell worked the early delivery shift 3 mornings a week, and the afternoon stocking shift 2 afternoons. He had been doing it since he was 12. Agnes paid him fairly, which meant she paid him what the work was actually worth, rather than what someone his age might be expected to accept, a distinction that Agnes made explicitly, and that Darnell had understood immediately as a form of respect that he intended to earn every week. The morning delivery took him through a route that covered 12 stops, mostly elderly residents who had standing orders and who appreciated the reliability of the same face at the same time each week. He knew their names and their preferences and the way each of them opened their door. Mrs. Patterson with the security chain still on, until she could verify it was him, old Mr. Dubose, who was already on the porch waiting as though the delivery was the event he had built his morning around, which it might have been. He was on his way back from the last stop, the empty cart rolling ahead of him, when he saw the motorcycle. It was parked at an angle on the shoulder of Calvary Street, partly on the gravel, the front tire pointing slightly downhill the way vehicles drifted when they were stopped in a hurry, rather than parked with intention. The bike itself was a thing of considerable presence, even standing still, black and chrome and built to a scale that suggested it had been designed to communicate something about the person who rode it, something about what they were willing to put between themselves and the road. The woman standing beside it was not looking at him. She was looking at the rear tire with the expression of someone who has been inconvenienced in a way they find both irritating and slightly beneath them, as though the tire had made a personal decision to go flat. And she had opinions about that decision. She had her hands on her hips and she was wearing riding gloves, and her jacket said Hell's Angels on the back, and her arms below where the jacket sleeves ended were covered in ink, dark and dense, the kind of coverage that had been built over years. Darnell stopped. He stood there for a moment and assessed the situation the way he assessed most situations, quickly, and without a great deal of internal drama. There was a motorcycle with a flat tire. He had a kit in his delivery bag that he carried because he rode a bicycle, and bicycle tires also went flat, and it was better to have what you needed than to wish you had brought it. The kit was not designed for a motorcycle tire, but there were principles that applied across the difference, and he had watched his Uncle Lester fix enough tires of varying sizes that he had a reasonable working knowledge of the process. He rolled his cart over. He set the brake on the cart and opened his bag and took out the kit, and he crouched down beside the rear tire without saying anything first. The valve stem was visible and the hiss of slow leakage was audible at close range, a patient, steady sound. He had the deflation gauge on it before he spoke. He said, "Looks like the valve stem is loose. Might be able to seal it without a full patch." The woman looked at him. She looked at him the way someone looks at something unexpected. Not with alarm, but with the focused attention of a person who has learned to assess things rapidly and is currently assessing. He met her eyes briefly, and then went back to the tire because the tire was the thing that needed his attention, and he had been raised to finish what he started. He worked quietly. The morning was already warm, and the sound of the street was the ordinary sound of Calhoun waking up a truck on the main road. The distant announcement of someone's dog, the birds. He had the stem secured and the tire partially reinflated from the small hand pump in his kit within about 8 minutes, and then he used the last of the sealant to finish it a temporary fix, rather than a permanent one, enough to get to a proper shop without the thing going down on her again. He stood up. He said, "That will hold for 20 or 30 miles easy, but you will want to get someone to look at the stem proper when you get where you are going. The thread is worn." The woman looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the situation strictly required. She had pale eyes, gray or green depending on the light, and they had the quality of eyes that had seen a considerable variety of things and had arrived at a place beyond easy surprise. She said, "You did not ask if I needed help. You just helped." He said, "Yes, ma'am. The tire needed fixing." She looked at him for another moment. She said, "What is your name?" He told her. She said, "I am Joyce," and she said it as though the name by itself was sufficient information, which in the world she moved through it was. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and took out her wallet, and he shook his head before she could open it. He said, "I did not do it for money. I did it because the tire needed fixing." He picked up his kit and put it back in his delivery bag and released the brake on his cart and started back toward Whitfield's General. He heard her start the engine behind him. That deep, sustained sound of the Harley coming to life, a sound you felt as much as heard. He did not look back. He went to work. He did not think about it again, not in any sustained way, not during the afternoon stocking shift, when he moved boxes from the back of Agnes's delivery truck to the shelves in the organized and efficient manner that Agnes had taught him, and that he had internalized as the correct way to do things. He thought about it briefly once while he was on a ladder reaching for the top shelf, and the thought was simply that she had looked at him differently after. Not the way people sometimes looked at him when he did something they had not expected, with that quality of surprise that contained within it the prior assumption that had made the surprise possible. She had looked at him the way you looked at something you were reassessing. Then he forgot about it. He ate dinner with his mother, the two of them at the small table in the kitchen, with the window open to the summer evening, and the neighborhood making its sounds around them. Delma talked about her day at the factory, a careful, edited version of it, the version that removed the weight and left only the surface. Darnell listened and asked the right questions. He had learned early that listening to his mother was its own form of contribution. He did his homework. He went to bed. He woke up to an engine, then to more engines, then to the sound of a street that had been transformed overnight into something that had no precedent in his 14 years of living on it. Agnes Whitfield came to the Odom house at 9:30 that morning. She came the way Agnes went everywhere directly and without announcement, rapping on the door with the knuckle of her middle finger, in the sharp, efficient knock that was recognizable as hers to everyone in the neighborhood. She was 68 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had made her peace with age by refusing to allow it to slow her down in any dimension that mattered. Her hair was white and kept short, and she wore it without apology. She had been friends with Delma's mother before she was friends with Delma, and she had known Darnell since he was small enough to sit on the counter of Whitfield's General and eat animal crackers from the jar she kept for that purpose. Delma let her in. Joyce Mack was still at the kitchen table working through a second cup of coffee, and the two women looked at each other with the mutual assessment of people meeting for the first time, who are each accustomed to being the most significant person in a room, and are determining how to arrange themselves around that fact. Then Agnes sat down and poured herself coffee from the pot on the counter without asking and said, "I need to talk to you both, and your boy if he is available." Darnell was in the doorway. Agnes looked at him. She had a way of looking at him that was different from the way most adults looked at him, which was to say, she looked at him the way she looked at anyone directly, and without the slight adjustment that some people made when they were speaking to someone young, the small reduction in what they expected to be received and understood. Agnes had never made that reduction with him, and he had always been grateful for it without being able to articulate why until he was older. She said, "What I am about to tell you I have been sitting on since Herbert died. Herbert was my husband. He passed 11 months ago. Some of you know that." Joyce Mack nodded once. Agnes said Herbert kept books for a company called Meridian Development Partners for about 6 years. He took the work because it paid better than most accounting work available in this county, and we needed it. He did not know what the company was doing when he started. He figured it out eventually. She put her hands flat on the table. She said over the past 4 years, 7 families in this county have received eminent domain notices or code violation citations that resulted in them losing their property. All 7 families are black. All 7 properties are located within a half-mile corridor that runs along the eastern edge of town, roughly parallel to where the new federal highway expansion is going to be routed. That routing has not been publicly announced. Dennis Stoll knows about it because he has been involved in the federal consultation process in his capacity as mayor. He has known about it for at least 4 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Agnes said Meridian Development Partners has quietly acquired 6 of those 7 properties since the families vacated them. Meridian is structured to obscure its ownership, but Herbert traced it. The primary beneficial owner, the person who actually controls the company and profits from its acquisitions, is Dennis Stoll. He has been using his authority as mayor to force families off land that he then acquires through a company that no one can easily connect to him on land that he knows will be worth many times its current value once the highway routing is announced. She reached into the bag she had brought and placed a manila folder on the table. She said Herbert kept copies of everything. He kept them because he knew what he was looking at, and he knew it was wrong, and he knew that one day someone would need to see it. He was going to take it somewhere himself, but he got sick before he could figure out where to take it. That would actually matter. And then he was gone. And I have been sitting here with this folder for 11 months, trying to figure out who to give it to, because in this town, there is no one to give it to. The sheriff is Stoll's cousin. The county judge has been playing golf with Stoll for 20 years. Every official mechanism that should exist for something like this has Stoll's fingerprints on it. She looked at Joyce Mack. She said, And then your motorcycle showed up on Birch Street this morning, and I thought, well, maybe that is an answer. Joyce Mack looked at the folder. She did not reach for it immediately. She sat with what she had been told for a moment in the way she seemed to sit with everything fully and without rushing to the next thing. Then she looked at Darnell. He was still in the doorway. He had listened to everything Agnes said, and he was listening in two directions at once, to the words themselves, and to something underneath the words, a shape that was assembling itself as she spoke, a pattern that he had been looking at pieces of for longer than he had realized. Because there was something Agnes did not know yet. There was something no one at the table knew yet except Darnell. And he had not known it was significant until this moment when Agnes laid the folder on the table, and the pieces he had been carrying separately suddenly arranged themselves into a single coherent image. He had been making a map. He had not called it, that had not thought of it consciously as anything more than something he did because he was the kind of person who noticed things and wrote them down. The same way he was the kind of person who stopped to fix a flat tire without being asked. For the past year, ever since the Greer family on Elm Street had gotten their notice and left with their furniture in a borrowed pickup truck and their front door standing open behind them, as though they had left in the middle of a thought, he had been writing things down. Addresses, dates, the names on the official notices when he could see them, the names of the companies on the survey stakes that appeared on vacant lots after families left. He had put it all on a piece of graph paper he kept folded in the back of his school notebook. He had never shown it to anyone because he had not known what it was for. He had only known that the pattern was there, visible to him, in the way that patterns became visible when you paid close enough attention, for long enough, and that patterns of this kind did not happen by accident. He went to his room and got the graph paper. He came back and unfolded it on the kitchen table next to Agnes's folder. The three women looked at it. Agnes picked it up. She studied it. She looked at the folder and then at the map, and then at Darnell, and something crossed her face that was not quite any single emotion, but a combination of several, grief and something like recognition, and something that might have been the feeling of a thing you have been waiting for, finally arriving from a direction you did not anticipate. She said, Herbert's folder has the company records and the financial trail. Your map has the spatial pattern. Together they show the same thing from two different directions. She looked at Joyce Mack. She said, is that enough? Joyce Mack had been looking at the map and the folder together for a moment, her hands flat on the table, her pale eyes moving between the two documents. She looked like someone adding a column of numbers in her head and arriving at a sum that confirmed what she had already suspected. She said, it depends on where you take it. Darnell said, what do you mean where you take it? Joyce Mack looked at him. She said, evidence does not do anything by itself. It has to go to someone with the authority and the jurisdiction to act on it. In this county, from what Agnes is telling me, every person with local authority is compromised. That means you have to go above local. You have to go to someone who operates outside what Stoll can reach. Darnell said, like who? Joyce Mack said, that is what I need to think about. Delma had been quiet through most of this, sitting with her hands folded on the table, listening with the focused attention of someone who is taking in information that is both larger than she expected, and somehow in some way she had not fully processed yet, not entirely a surprise. She looked at the map her son had made, and then at the folder, and then at her son. And she did the thing she did when she was feeling something she was not ready to say. She pressed her lips together briefly and looked at the window. Then she said, how long have you been making this map? Darnell said, about a year. She said, since the Greers left. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly. She picked up the map and looked at it more carefully. She was not a woman who had ever had occasion to read a map of this kind. A map of harm, of a pattern of taking laid out spatially, so that the logic of it became visible. The way a logic that was easy to miss in individual instances became unavoidable when you put them all in the same frame at the same time. She set it down. She said, "Those are our neighbors." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And us." He said, "We are on the list for the next round. I think we have 60 days, maybe less, before they find something to cite us on." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then the sound of the engines from outside filled the silence, that low, sustained presence of 200 machines idling in the street. The sound that had woken the neighborhood before the sun cleared the trees. And for a moment it seemed less like background noise and more like a response to something. An answer to something that had been asked quietly in the dark for a long time. Agnes looked at Joyce Mack. She said, "So what do we do?" Joyce Mack said, "First thing we do is make copies of everything. Every page in that folder, every mark on that map. 3 sets kept in 3 different places." She paused. She said, "And then we figure out where to take it." Darnell was already thinking about where to take it. He had been thinking about it without knowing he was thinking about it from the moment Agnes put the folder on the table and the map on the table, and the sum of the two of them made the shape of the problem clear. He was 14 years old, and he had grown up in a small town in Georgia. And he knew in the way you know things that the circumstances of your life have made unavoidable. To know that the distance between a problem and the people who had the authority to solve it was often measured not in miles but in access, in the question of who you knew, and who would return your call, and who would take seriously what you were bringing to them. He did not know any of those people, but he knew of them. There was a class in school American history that he had taken the previous year, taught by a man named Mr. Briggs, who had the quality of a teacher who had made peace with the fact that most of his students would retain only a fraction of what he told them, and had therefore decided to make that fraction count. He taught the civil rights movement with a specificity that most textbooks avoided, not just the names and the dates and the famous photographs, but the mechanisms, the legal strategies, the organizations that had built infrastructure for exactly this kind of fight. The structures that existed to take the evidence of harm to the people who could act on it. Darnell remembered the name. He had written it in his notebook, not because he expected to need it, but because it was the kind of thing he wrote down. The kind of thing that seemed like it might matter someday for reasons he could not predict. NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Atlanta office. He knew this the way he knew a great many things that he had absorbed from paying attention, in rooms where people sometimes forgot he was paying attention. He held it now in his mind and turned it over, and thought about what it would take to get there, to put what was in that folder and what was on that map in front of someone who had the jurisdiction and the authority and the freedom from Stoll's reach to do something with it. He thought about the bus schedule. The bus from Calhoun to Atlanta ran twice a day. The morning bus left at 7:45. The ticket was $11 one way. He had $14 in his room. He did not say any of this at the table. He listened to Joyce Mack and Agnes talk through the logistics of copying the documents, and who could be trusted to hold copies, and what the next steps in their thinking were. He watched his mother's face as she listened, the way she processed what was being said, the gravity of it settling into her, and he made his plan quietly, the way he did most things without announcing it, without asking permission. because the question of whether permission would be granted was a question he already knew the answer to, and the thing needed doing regardless. Outside on Birch Street, the engines of 200 Harley-Davidsons idled in the morning heat, patient and present, holding the street in a way it had never been held before, filling it with a sound that the neighbors who came out to look at it would not forget. That would come back to them at odd moments for years afterward. The frequency of it, the way it had settled into the neighborhood like something that had always been coming and had simply taken this long to arrive. Darnell sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on his thighs and listened to the women plan and listened to the engines outside and looked at the map he had made over a year of quiet watching all those addresses and dates arranged on graph paper in his own handwriting. And he understood something that he did not yet have the full vocabulary for, but that he felt with the completeness of a physical thing. The map was not just a record of what had been taken. It was a direction. It was pointing somewhere. And the question was not whether someone was going to follow it, but who was going to go first. He already knew the answer to that too. He just was not ready to say it out loud yet. The morning moved on. The engines outside settled into a quieter idle, and then some of them went silent altogether as riders dismounted and stood in the street. In the heat, patient and unhurried their presence in the neighborhood, an undeniable fact that the neighborhood was still in the process of integrating into its understanding of itself. Mayor Dennis Stoll drove past twice more that morning. The second time, he slowed almost to a stop in front of the Odom house and sat there for a long moment before moving on. Darnell saw it from the window. He watched the dark blue town car with the city seal on the door move slowly down Birch Street through the rows of motorcycles, and he thought about the way Stoll had looked at him that morning, the assessment in it, the specific quality of a man measuring something he was not certain about yet. He thought about what Agnes had said. 7 families. 4 years. The corridor of land along the eastern edge of town. The highway that was coming and that only Stoll knew was coming. He thought about the folder on the kitchen table and the map he had made, and he thought about a town in which every mechanism of accountability had been arranged to protect the man doing the harm. He looked at the bus schedule on his phone. 7:45, $11. $14 in his room. He thought about Atlanta. He thought about a room where someone with the right jurisdiction would sit across from him and open a folder and look at a map and have the authority to do something that this town on its own could not. The summer morning moved around him, the heat and the engines and the sound of his town going about its business, and Darnell Odom stood at the window of the house on Birch Street and looked out at the street full of motorcycles and felt the shape of what was coming taking form around him, assembling itself from the pieces that had been gathering for a long time. He did not know how all of it would resolve. He only knew what needed doing, and he had always been the kind of person who did what needed doing without waiting to be asked. The copies got made at Whitfield's General. Agnes had a machine in the back office that she used for invoices and inventory records, and the occasional letter to the county health inspector, whom she had been corresponding with on various matters of mutual disagreement for going on 11 years. The machine was slow and loud and tended to jam on anything thicker than standard paper. But it worked, and it was in a room with a door that locked, which was what mattered. Joyce Mack stood in the doorway of the back office, while Agnes fed pages through one at a time, and Darnell sat on the stool in the corner where he usually sat, when he was waiting for Agnes to finish something before she needed him to start something else. And the sound of the machine filled the small room, and outside the store, the summer morning went about its business, the street traffic and the heat and the ordinary sounds of Calhoun conducting itself. 3 sets of everything. Agnes kept one set in the safe behind the panel in the back wall of her office. The panel that looked like part of the baseboard, but swung out on a hinge if you knew where to press. Her father had built it when the store was new, and Agnes had used it for 40 years to store things that needed to be stored without advertising that they were being stored. Joyce Mack took one set and put it in the interior pocket of her jacket against her body. The third set went into a manila envelope that Darnell sealed and addressed and took to the post office on Calvary Street before noon, mailing it to a name and address that Joyce had written on a piece of paper and given him without explanation. A chapter member in Birmingham who would hold it without opening it until told otherwise. When he got back to Whitfield's General, Joyce was sitting at the counter drinking coffee, and Agnes was behind the register doing the thing she did in the afternoon when the lunch rush had passed, and the store went quiet, which was reading. She read with serious, focused attention, the attention of someone who considered it a productive activity rather than a leisure one. And she set the book face down on the counter when Darnell came in. She said, "Joyce was telling me about the pattern in your map." He said, "What about it?" Agnes said, "There are 7 properties on your map. Herbert's records account for 6 of them. The 7th one, the Greer property on Elm, is not in his files. He might not have had access to those transactions. Do you know anything about how that one went through?" Darnell said, "Mrs. Greer told my mother the notice said structural deficiency, something about the foundation. But the house was 40 years old, and nothing had ever been wrong with the foundation before. They had a man come look at it, and he said it was fine. But by then the process was already moving, and they did not have money to fight it legally." Agnes nodded. She looked at Joyce. Joyce said, "Code violation is a different mechanism than eminent domain, but it produces the same result. If you control the inspector and the appeals process, you can manufacture a deficiency on any structure in the county. The homeowner has to prove the violation does not exist, which requires money and lawyers and time. And if you can move the process fast enough, most people do not have all 3 simultaneously." She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of fact, without emphasis. The way you describe the weather, rather than express an opinion about it. But underneath the flatness of it was something that Darnell recognized as its own kind of temperature. He had been listening to Joyce Mack for 2 days now, and he had arrived at an understanding of her that he suspected most people did not arrive at quickly, because most people were distracted by the surface of her. The jacket and the tattoos and the voice and the general impression of a woman who had made a deliberate choice to present herself in a way that required other people to decide early whether they were going to engage or look away. Those who looked away never got to the part underneath the part that Darnell was beginning to see, which was a mind that worked with the precision and patience of someone who had spent decades solving problems that the ordinary mechanisms of society had declined to solve for her. She thought the way he thought he was realizing, just with more years behind it. He went to work. Agnes had a delivery in the afternoon, and he did it the route through the residential streets east of Maine with the cart and the bags and the familiar knock at the familiar doors. He did it the way he always did it, with his full attention, and without hurrying, because hurrying produced errors. And errors in his line of work meant inconveniencing people who were counting on him. And he did not inconvenience people who were counting on him. But his mind was doing something else at the same time. It was doing what it had been doing since Agnes put the folder on the kitchen table, which was assembling. Taking the pieces that were now available and arranging them against the pieces he had already carried. Testing configurations, looking for the shape that held. He knew about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund because of Mr. Briggs and his American history class, and the care Mr. Briggs had taken to teach. Not just what had happened, but how it had happened. The infrastructure of it. The organizations that had built the legal architecture for exactly the kind of fight that this situation looked like from where Darnell was standing. He knew they had an office in Atlanta. He had looked it up once, not because he had a reason to at the time, but because he was the kind of person who looked things up when they caught his attention and wrote the information in his notebook. For the same reason he put things in his delivery bag that he might need because it was better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. The address was in his notebook. The bus left at 7:45 in the morning. He was still turning it over when he came back to the store and found Joyce in the back room with the folder open on the table and a legal pad beside it, working through something in a focused, methodical way, making notes in a handwriting that was small and dense and difficult to read from any angle but her own. She looked up when he came in. She said, "I have been on the phone with the chapter president. He wants me to bring the documentation to him and let the chapter lawyers look at it before we decide how to proceed." Darnell said, "How long will that take?" Joyce said a week, maybe 2. Lawyers do not move fast as a rule. Darnell said we might not have 2 weeks. She looked at him. He said if Stoll saw all those motorcycles on our street this morning, and he knows what you are, and he knows you are looking at something, he is going to move faster. He is going to find his reason to cite us before you have time to build a case. He controls the inspector and the process. He can have papers on our door in 3 days if he decides to. Joyce looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are probably right." He said then, "Whatever we are going to do, we need to do it in a way that does not give him time to get ahead of it." She said, "I agree with that. The question is how." He said, "I have been thinking about that." She waited. He said the problem with going through local channels is that every local channel runs through Stoll, or someone Stoll controls. The sheriff, the county judge. Anyone with authority in this county either owes him something or is related to him, or has enough of their own business to protect that they are not going to risk it. So local is a dead end. She said yes. That is what I said. He said, "But federal is different. Federal jurisdiction does not care who Stoll plays golf with. The Fair Housing Act is a federal statute. If what he is doing is what Agnes's husband documented, it is a federal violation. It does not matter that the county is in his pocket if the violation is federal." Joyce was quiet for a moment. She said, "You have thought about this more than you have let on." He said, "I think about most things more than I let on." She looked at him with that quality she had, the quality of genuine reassessment. Not the surface version of it, but the real thing, the actual revision of a prior estimate. She said, "The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has federal litigation capacity. They have handled exactly this kind of case." He said, "I know. They have an office in Atlanta." She said, "You would need someone to take you." He said, "I would need a bus ticket and an appointment." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me make some calls tonight. See if I can get someone on the phone there tomorrow. Set something up before we go in." He nodded. He went home for dinner. The next morning, Joyce was not at the house on Birch Street when Darnell woke up. He knew because he looked out the window at the street which had thinned overnight, as riders dispersed to wherever they went when they were not filling a neighborhood street with their presence. A dozen bikes remained parked at the curb, and Wade Pruitt was sitting on the hood of a truck at the end of the block, reading something on his phone, but Joyce's bike was not among the ones remaining. Darnell ate breakfast. He went to work at Whitfield's General and did the morning stocking and said nothing to Agnes about what he was thinking. Agnes was in her office on the phone with a supplier for most of the morning, her voice carrying through the closed door in the register she used when she was negotiating, which was the register of a woman who had been negotiating with suppliers for 40 years and knew exactly how long to be patient and exactly when to stop. Joyce came in at 11. She looked at Darnell and said, "I spoke with someone at the Legal Defense Fund last night. They know the Fair Housing Act issues in this part of Georgia. They have been watching this county for a while." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means they are interested. It means if we bring them the right documentation, they will look at it seriously. I told them what we have and they want to see it in person." He said, "When?" She said, "They can see us the day after tomorrow if we can get there." He said, "Us." She said, "I was planning to take you. I assumed you would want to go." He said, "Yes, I want to go." She said, "I will pick you up at 6 in the morning. It is a 2-hour ride." He nodded. That evening, Dennis Stoll came to the house on Birch Street, not in the town car this time, in his personal vehicle, a pickup truck that was newer than most of the trucks in Calhoun, and cleaner, the kind of truck that was purchased to convey a relationship to the county's identity without being actually used for the purposes that relationship implied. He parked in front and came to the door and knocked with the cadence of a man who was used to doors opening for him. Delma answered. Stoll was in khakis and a button shirt, no jacket. The deliberately casual register of a man who wanted to communicate that this was a friendly visit, a neighborly visit, the kind of visit that officials who care about their constituents make when they want to check in on people they have heard might be having a difficult time. He said he was concerned. He said he had heard that Delma had received some upsetting news recently about the property, and he wanted to come personally to discuss it, to see if there was anything that could be done to make the process easier for the family. Delma stood in the doorway and listened to this. Then she said, "What process, Dennis?" He said, "The review of the property, the structural assessment that had been ordered." He said it as though this was something she already knew about, as though it was something that had been discussed and agreed to, and was simply now proceeding through its normal stages. Delma said, "I have not received any notice about a structural assessment." Stoll said it would have gone to the property owner of record. He named a person who was not Delma, who was the owner of the building, Delma being the tenant. He said sometimes these notices took time to filter through. He said he was sure it was nothing serious. He said these assessments were routine. He said the county was doing a comprehensive review of older residential structures, and it was nothing personal, just process. And he hoped she understood that, and he wanted her to know his door was always open if she had concerns. He said all of this in the smooth, practiced way of a man who had said versions of it many times, who had refined the delivery through use until it had the quality of something natural rather than constructed. Delma said, "Thank you for coming by, Dennis." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hands still on the door handle. Then she went to the kitchen and sat down. Darnell came out of his room where he had been listening. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. She said, "He is moving faster because of the motorcycles." He said, "Yes, ma'am. That is what I thought." She said, "How fast?" He said, "I do not know, but faster than we had." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "What are you planning to do?" He said, "Go to Atlanta. Take the documentation to people who can do something about it." She looked at him. He said, "Joyce was going to take me the day after tomorrow, but I am thinking it needs to be sooner." Delma said, "How much sooner?" He said, "Tomorrow." She was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I know how to get there. I have looked up the bus. 7:45. I have enough for a ticket." She said, "Darnell." He said, "The Legal Defense Fund already knows we are coming. Joyce set up the meeting. I just need to go a day earlier than we planned." She said, "You are 14 years old." He said, "Yes, ma am. And I am the one who made the map. And I am the one who knows what is in that folder. And I can explain it clearly to anyone who needs to understand it. Joyce is better used here making sure nothing happens to Agnes or to the copies before the meeting happens." Delma looked at him for a long time. She was doing the thing she did when she was weighing something that she already knew the answer to and was taking the time to be sure she was right about knowing it. He had seen her do it his whole life. It was one of the things he had learned from watching her, the value of not rushing the moment between receiving information and acting on it even when the action was already decided. She said, "You call me when you get there." He said, "Yes, ma am." She said, "You call me when you are in the meeting, and you call me when you are leaving, and you call me from the bus." He said, "Yes, ma am." She got up from the table and went to the counter and opened the ceramic jar where they kept the household cash and counted out $15 and put it on the table. She said, "For the ticket and something to eat." He said, "I have 14. She said, "Take the 15 too." She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while and looked at the money and thought about the morning, the bus, the 2 hours through Georgia farm country and suburb, and then the city coming up around him, and what he was going to say when he got there, and who he was going to say it to, and how to say it in a way that made the shape of the problem clear the way it was clear to him, the way it had been clear since he first put the addresses on the graph paper and saw the line they made. He went to bed. He was up at 5. He dressed quietly and took the folder and the copy of the map that Joyce had given him from the set she had made the previous day and put them in his school backpack. He put the money in his pocket. He wrote a note for his mother, even though she knew, because writing it down was a way of making it formal, of treating it with the seriousness it deserved. He left it on the kitchen table. He left the house at 5:45. The street was quiet. 3 motorcycles still at the curb. Wade Pruitt's truck was gone. The morning was already warm, the humidity of a Georgia summer that arrived before the sun and stayed long after it set. And the birds were doing what the birds did at that hour, the full orchestral expression of their territorial requirements. He walked to the bus station on Merchant Street. He bought his ticket. He sat in the plastic chair by the window and watched the street and thought about things and tried not to think about things simultaneously, the way you tried to manage the gap between what you could control and what you could not. The bus came on time. He got on, took a window seat on the right side, put his backpack on his lap, and looked out at Calhoun receding behind him, the water tower and the steeple of First Baptist, and the rooftops of the neighborhood where he had grown up arranged against the tree line, and then the trees themselves, the Georgia pines and the kudzu, and the red earth of the road cuts along the highway, and then the open country between here and there. He did not sleep. He was not tired, or rather, he was tired in a way that sleep would not address, the kind of tired that was less about the body than about the sustained attention required to hold something large and remain functional at the same time. He looked out the window and thought about the folder in his backpack and the things it contained and the way Agnes had described her husband, sitting alone with that knowledge for the months before he died, knowing what it meant and not knowing where to take it. He thought about the Greer family on Elm Street, the door left standing open, the furniture in a borrowed pickup. He thought about the other 6 families, the addresses on his map, the pattern that was not a coincidence. He thought about Mayor Dennis Stoll at the door of the house on Birch Street in his clean pickup, and his khakis performing concern in the practiced way, talking about the structural assessment in the tone of a man explaining something routine when what he was actually doing was communicating the thing that men who have institutional power communicate to people they intend to displace, which was that the machinery was already in motion, and you could feel its weight before it arrived. The bus moved through the Georgia morning. Atlanta appeared gradually the way cities appear from a distance, first as a thickening of the air, then as an accumulation of rooftops and overpasses, and the steel and glass towers gathering on the horizon, until they filled the window and the space around the bus became urban, became the compressed urgency of a large city. And Darnell sat up straighter in his seat, because this was the part he had been preparing for. And it was here now. He got off at the terminal on Forsyth Street. He had the address written in his notebook. He walked 8 blocks north and 2 blocks east through the geography of downtown Atlanta in the morning, the office workers and the delivery trucks and the heat coming off the pavement, until he found the building. He went inside. The office was on the 4th floor. The elevator was slow. He stood in it with his backpack held against his chest, the way you held something that mattered. The receptionist was a woman in her 40s who looked up when he came in, and then looked at him again in a slightly different way, the way adults looked at him when they were recalibrating when his age was creating a dissonance with whatever expectation had preceded him. He said his name. He said he had spoken with someone here the previous day, or someone had spoken on his behalf, and he had documents relevant to a Fair Housing Act matter in Holt County, Georgia, and he was hoping to speak with someone who could look at them. She asked him to wait. He sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the street 4 floors below, and the city moving through its morning. A man came out after 12 minutes. He was in his early 40s, wearing a shirt without a tie, with the focused, efficient manner of someone who was never not working on something. He introduced himself as David Raines' staff attorney. He shook Darnell's hand with the quality of a handshake that makes no adjustment for the age of the person receiving it, which Darnell noticed immediately, and filed under the category of things that told you something true about a person quickly. He said, "I understand you have documentation related to a property acquisition pattern in Holt County." Darnell said, "Yes, sir." Raines said, "How about you come back and walk me through it?" They sat at a table in a conference room that had windows on 2 sides and natural light, and a large whiteboard on the 3rd wall, and a phone in the center of the table that nobody was using. Raines had a legal pad and a pen, and he placed them in front of himself. And then he looked at Darnell and said, "Go ahead." Darnell opened his backpack. He took out the folder. He took out the copy of the map. He laid them on the table between them, and then he began. He had not rehearsed it, not formally, but he had been thinking about how to say it for 2 days. And the thinking had organized it into a sequence that he trusted. He started with the pattern, the spatial layout of the 7 properties, the corridor. They described the relationship of that corridor to the federal highway expansion routing that had not been publicly announced. He showed Raines the map and let him look at it and ask his first questions before he moved to the financial documentation. Then he walked through what was in the folder: the company records, the ownership trail to Meridian Development Partners, the connection to Stoll, the timeline of acquisitions following the forced vacations of the properties. Raines listened. He asked questions that were good questions, precise and specific. The questions of someone who understood the legal architecture of what Darnell was describing and was checking the documentation against that architecture. He wrote things on his legal pad. He went back to certain pages in the folder and looked at them again. He did not hurry Darnell. He did not speak to him in the register adults sometimes used with young people, the register that reduced the complexity of what it was willing to address. He spoke to him the way he would have spoken to anyone sitting across that table with that folder, which was as a person delivering substantive information that required substantive engagement. When Darnell finished, Raines sat back in his chair. He said, "How old are you?" Darnell said 14. Raines was quiet for a moment. He said, "This documentation, the financial records, where did these originate?" Darnell explained about Herbert Whitfield, about the accounting work, about the copies kept, and the folder passed to Agnes and then to him. Raines said, "And the map, the spatial analysis." Darnell said, "I made that. Over about a year, just writing down what I noticed." Raines looked at the map again. He said, "You identified a federal highway routing that has not been publicly disclosed." Darnell said, "I did not know for certain what the corridor was for, until Agnes's husband's records confirmed it. I just knew the properties were in a line, and that lines usually meant something." Raines set his pen down. He said, "I need to make some calls. I need to bring in a colleague who handles our fair housing litigation. This is going to take a little time." "Are you able to wait?" Darnell said. "Yes, sir. I have got nowhere else to be." Raines almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He left the room. Darnell sat at the conference table and looked out the window at Atlanta and thought about Calhoun, about the street on Birch with the motorcycles in the early morning light, about his mother counting out $15 on the kitchen table, about Agnes feeding pages through the copier one at a time in the back room of Whitfield's General, about Joyce Mack watching Stoll's town car move through the rows of parked bikes. He called his mother. She answered before the second ring. He said, "I am here. I am in the office. I have shown them everything." She said, "Are they going to help?" He said, "I think so." The man said he needed to make calls. He said he wanted to bring in someone who does this work specifically. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yes, I am. I am fine." She said, "Eat something." He said, "Yes, I am." He did not eat anything. He was not hungry. He sat at the conference table and waited and watched the city. 40 minutes later, Raines came back with a woman named Patricia Owens. She was in her 50s with the contained authority of someone who had been doing something very specific for a very long time and had arrived at a relationship with it that was past the stage of needing to perform competence and was simply competent entirely and without effort. She sat down and looked at the folder and the map. She looked at Darnell. She said, "David tells me you have been tracking this for a year." He said about that. She said, "And the family whose property is most recently at risk. That is your family." He said, "Yes, I am. My mother and I. We rent. The building is owned by someone else, but we would be displaced." She nodded. She said, "I need to tell you something about this case. We received a tip about Mayor Stoll approximately 6 months ago. A written communication anonymous alleging systematic property fraud in Holt County along the lines of what you are describing. At the time, we did not have enough documentation to act on it. The tip described what was happening, but could not substantiate it with the specific financial records." She touched the folder on the table. She said, "What you have brought us today is what was missing. The documentation your source kept. This is the evidentiary foundation. We could not build without it. The tip and the documentation together create a case." Darnell said, "Who sent the tip?" Patricia Owens said it was anonymous. We do not know. Darnell sat with that. He thought about who in Holt County had known what was happening 6 months ago, and had known it was wrong, and had known that local channels were useless, and had found this organization's address and sent them something in writing. He had a feeling he knew, but he said nothing about it then. Patricia Owens spent another hour with him going through the documentation systematically, asking questions and writing notes, and occasionally stepping out to make calls. Rains came and went. Other people drifted through the conference room doorway, paused, looked at the materials on the table, exchanged looks with Owens, and left. At the end of it, Owens said, "We are going to open a formal investigation. We are going to file for a federal injunction to halt any further property actions in the affected corridor pending the outcome. And we are going to be in contact with the Department of Justice about the criminal dimension of this, because what your documentation shows goes beyond a civil violation." She said, "This is going to take time. Investigations take time. But once we file the injunction, Stoll cannot proceed with any new property actions while it is active. That protects your family's home in the immediate term." Darnell said how long to file the injunction. She said 72 hours, possibly less. He said, "We may not have 72 hours. He came to our door last night talking about a structural assessment that has been ordered. He is moving faster because of something that happened yesterday." She said, "Tell me about that." He told her about Joyce Mack and the chapter, and the motorcycles on Birch Street. He told it straight without editorializing the same way he had told everything else. Patricia Owens listened. Then she said, "We will file the injunction today, not tomorrow. Today." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Thank you. You walked in here at 14 years old with documentation that we have been unable to build for 6 months. Do not thank us." He packed his backpack. He shook hands with Raines and with Owens, and with a third person whose name he did not catch. He took the elevator down. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building on the Atlanta street and called his mother. She answered on the first ring. He said, "They are filing an injunction today. It stops Stoll from doing anything to any of the properties while the investigation is open." Delma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Today." He said, "Yes, ma'am." They said today. She was quiet for longer this time. He heard something in the silence that he recognized without being able to name something that had the quality of a door opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. The sound of air moving where it had not been moving before. She said, "Come home." He said, "Yes, ma'am. I am heading to the bus now." He walked to the terminal. He bought his ticket. He sat in the plastic chair and waited for the bus and thought about what Patricia Owens had said about the anonymous tip. 6 months ago, someone who knew what Stoll was doing and knew the local channels were useless and had found the Legal Defense Fund address and sent them something in writing. He thought about the 7 properties on his map and the first family on the list. The first family to receive the notice. The first family to lose their home and leave Calhoun without anyone hearing them or helping them. The family that had driven away with their furniture in a borrowed pickup 3 years ago. He was still thinking about it when the bus came. Meanwhile, Joyce Mack was at Whitfield's General. She had found Darnell's note at the house on Birch Street at 6:45 that morning. A note left under the ceramic jar on the counter, and she had read it, and stood in the kitchen of the Odom house with it in her hand for a moment. And then she had put it in her jacket pocket and gone to find Agnes. Agnes was already open. She was always already open. Joyce came through the front door and said, "Your boy went to Atlanta." Agnes said, "I know." Delma called me. Joyce said, "Alone." Agnes said, "Yes." Joyce was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window of the store through which Calvary Street was visible in the morning light. And she looked at it the way she looked at things when she was thinking with the full directed attention of someone doing a calculation. Then she said, "Good." Agnes looked at her. Joyce said, "If I had taken him, I would have been the story. A Hell's Angel walking into the Legal Defense Fund with a 14-year-old boy and a folder of documents. The story becomes about us, about the chapter about whether we are a credible source. This way, the story is a boy from Holt County who made a map and found documentation and got on a bus. That is a different story. That is the story that matters." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You figured that out before or after you found the note?" Joyce said, "Before. I figured it out last night. I just was not certain he would do it without being asked." Agnes said, "You do not know him very well yet." Joyce said, "No. I am learning." She poured herself coffee from the pot Agnes kept on the counter for the morning regulars, and she sat on the stool by the register. And she took out her phone and made a call to Wade Pruitt and told him to keep 2 bikes on Birch Street within sight of the Odom house and 2 more within sight of Whitfield's General quietly, without drawing attention. Then she called the chapter president. She told him the boy had gone to Atlanta. She told him the Legal Defense Fund was now involved. She told him the chapter needed to be in Calhoun, visible and present, not as a threat, but as a fact on Saturday morning when the news of the injunction filing would reach Stoll, and his response would become a matter of record. She said, "I need the full chapter." Saturday. Calhoun. Every bike we can get. The chapter president asked how many she thought. She said as many as it takes for the whole town to see them. That was Thursday. On Thursday evening, Dennis Stoll sent someone to Whitfield's General. Not a lawyer. Not a city official. A man in an unmarked truck who came in and bought nothing and walked the aisles and then came to the counter and leaned on it and spoke to Agnes in a low voice about how a woman her age probably wanted to think carefully about her position in the community and about whether her store's licenses and inspection records were in order, and about how these things had a way of becoming complicated when they did not need to be complicated. Agnes listened to all of it. Then she said, "I have been in business in this county for 40 years. My father was in business here for 20 before that. You tell whoever sent you that if he wants to talk to me, he can come himself." The man left. Agnes locked the front door and went to the back office and called Joyce Mack. Joyce said, "Do not worry about the store." Agnes said, "I am not worried about the store. I am telling you so. You know what he is doing." Joyce said, "I know what he is doing. He is trying to close every door before Saturday. He does not know that the door that mattered is already open." Friday came. Darnell was at the store in the morning doing the stocking, moving through the routine of it with the sustained steadiness that had always been one of his reliable qualities. The ability to do ordinary things with full attention, even when the extraordinary was occupying another part of his mind. Agnes watched him work. She said at one point, "How do you feel?" He said, "I feel like I did the thing that needed doing." She said, "And does that help?" He thought about it. He said, "Yes, my am. It does." She nodded. She went back to her book. The injunction was filed Friday afternoon. Patricia Owens called Darnell's cell phone at 3:47 to tell him, and he was on the ladder in the store reaching for the top shelf with a box of canned goods, and he came down off the ladder and stood on the floor of Whitfield's General, in the middle of the afternoon light, and listened to her tell him that Federal Judge Marcus Healy of the Northern District of Georgia had signed the order halting all property acquisition and code enforcement actions in the affected corridor pending investigation, effective immediately. He thanked her. He hung up. He looked at Agnes across the store. He said, "It is done. The injunction is signed." Agnes set her book face down on the counter. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something arrived that she had believed was coming, but had still in some protected part of herself been uncertain of. The quiet of someone completing a breath they had been holding for longer than they realized. She said Herbert would have been glad. Darnell said, "Yes, ma'am." I think he would. He went back up the ladder. Friday evening, someone threw a brick through the front window of Whitfield's General. It came through at 9:43 after closing when Agnes was in the back office finishing the day's accounts, and Darnell had already gone home. The brick landed in the middle of the front aisle and skidded to a stop between the breakfast cereal and the canned soup, and lay there on the clean linoleum floor with a piece of paper rubber banded around it. Agnes came out of the office when she heard the sound. She stood in the doorway and looked at the broken window and the brick on the floor, and the night air coming through the gap, with its smell of warm Georgia summer. She walked to the brick. She unwound the rubber band. She unfolded the paper. The note said, "Old women should mind their business." Agnes stood in the middle of her store and read the note and looked at the broken window glass glittering on the floor in the light of the overhead fluorescence. She stood there for a long moment holding the paper. Then she went to the back office and reached under the desk and took out the box she had been saving for exactly this kind of moment. The box she had assembled in the weeks since Herbert died, when she had begun to understand that sitting on what she knew carried its own kind of risk. A box that contained copies of everything Herbert had left her, plus several things she had added herself. Additional documentation she had found in Herbert's files that she had not shown to Joyce or Darnell yet, because she had not been certain it was the right time. She was certain now. She took the box to the counter. She called Joyce Mack. She said, "Someone threw a brick through my window." There was a note. Joyce said, "Are you hurt?" Agnes said, "I am fine. But I have something I need to show you. Something I have been holding back. It is from Herbert's files. I want you to see it before tomorrow." Joyce said, "I will be there in 10 minutes. Agnes said, "There is also the name of a judge. It is in the files. The county judge who signed all 7 of the property orders, Judge Warren Ogle. Herbert's records show payments from Meridian to an account connected to Ogle's brother-in-law going back 3 years. Stoll did not do this alone. He never does with men like that. They always need the judiciary." The line was quiet for a moment. Then Joyce said, "I will be there in 10 minutes. Agnes set the phone down. She swept up the broken glass. She got a piece of cardboard from the back and taped it over the window frame, working methodically in the fluorescent light of her father's store, doing what needed doing the way she had always done what needed doing, without drama and without delay. When she finished, she stood at the counter and looked at the cardboard over the window, and the note on the counter beside the phone, and the box that held what Herbert had spent the last months of his life assembling. And she thought about her husband, and what he had believed, and what he had kept faith with, even when the keeping was difficult. He had believed someone would come. He had sent his own signal out into the world and waited. And what had come back was a boy on a bus with a folder and a map made on graph paper, and a woman on a motorcycle who had understood immediately the difference between what was hers to do and what was his. Agnes turned off the overhead light. She sat in the dark of the store and waited for Joyce Mack and thought about the morning that was coming, the sound of engines that would fill the street at dawn, the size and fact of what was bearing down on Calhoun, like weather that had been building for a long time, and had finally decided it was done. Waiting. Outside on Calvary Street, the night was quiet, but not for long. Saturday came in the way that days come when something large is waiting inside them. Not with fanfare, not with any sign in the sky or the air, just the ordinary arrival of light at the edge of the world. The Georgia dawn doing what it always did, pressing up from the east through the pines and the kudzu and the red clay fields until it found the rooftops of Calhoun and began its slow work of making the town visible again. Darnell was awake before it started. He had not slept much, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the alertness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down in the right place and is still adjusting to the change in their own weight, still learning what it feels like to stand without the burden they had gotten so accustomed to that they had stopped noticing it as a burden and started experiencing it as simply the condition of standing. He dressed. He went to the kitchen and made coffee the way his mother had taught him, the old way, with the stovetop pot that took longer but tasted different from the machine. And he sat at the kitchen table in the early light and drank it and listened to Calhoun wake up around him. Then he heard the first engine, just one at first, distant somewhere on the highway south of town, the unmistakable note of a Harley at road speed. Then another, then a third and a fourth arriving simultaneously from a different direction from the north, and then more overlapping and building until the single notes were indistinguishable from each other. And what he was hearing was not individual machines, but the collective sound of something large and deliberate moving toward a single point. He went to the window. The street was still empty, but the sound was growing, filling the air, the way a tide fills a low place, not rushing but inevitable, the kind of arrival that announces itself at a distance, so that by the time it reaches you there is nothing left to be surprised by, except the scale of it. He put on his jacket. He picked up his backpack, which had the folder in it and the map, because he had developed over the past several days the habit of keeping them close. The same habit that had made him carry a tire repair kit in a delivery bag, the instinct toward preparedness that was one of the oldest things about him. He went outside. The morning air was warm already and carried the smell of cut grass and the distant sweetness of something blooming at the edge of the neighborhood. He stood on the front porch of the house on Birch Street and watched the street and waited. They came around the corner at the south end of the block. First, 3 abreast, moving slowly and deliberately. The riders sitting upright with the easy authority of people who were not in a hurry, because they did not need to be in a hurry, because their presence itself was the statement, and the statement did not require speed to be made. More followed. More behind those. The sound built and built until it was less a sound than a physical fact, something the air itself was doing, vibrating at a frequency that you felt in your chest and your jaw and the soles of your feet against the porch boards. 400 motorcycles. They came from both ends of the block simultaneously, and they filled the street, and then the adjacent streets spilling out in both directions. The way water fills a vessel and finds every available space, until the sound of them was everywhere in the neighborhood. And the neighbors were coming out of their houses the way they had come out 3 days ago. The Wheeler family and the Battens and the others. But this time they came out differently, without the wariness of the first morning, with something closer to recognition, as though they had been waiting for this second arrival, without knowing they were waiting for it. Joyce Mack came around the corner on foot. She had parked her bike somewhere down the block, and she walked up Birch Street through the rows of idling machines with the ease of someone moving through their own living room. Nodding to riders she passed, exchanging a word here and there. And when she reached the Odom house, she came up the porch steps and stood beside Darnell and looked out at the street. She said, 412, came from 6 chapters. He said 6. She said, word got around. They stood together on the porch and looked at the street. And for a moment, neither of them said anything because what was in front of them did not require comment. It required only witness. Then Joyce said, Patricia Owens called me this morning. Early. The federal investigators are coming to Calhoun on Monday. They want to conduct interviews here in town, rather than having people travel. They are bringing a full team. Darnell said Monday. She said that gives Stoll the weekend to think about what is coming, which is intentional. The investigators want to see how he responds to knowing it is coming. How a man behaves when he knows the accounting is near tells you things that the accounting itself sometimes does not. Darnell said, what does that mean for us between now and Monday? Joyce said for you it means you go about your life. You go to work. You go to school when school starts. You let the process work. He said, and for you. She said, we stay visible, right here. As long as it is useful to stay visible. He nodded. Delma came out of the house behind them and stood on the porch in her bathrobe with her coffee and looked at the street full of motorcycles with the expression of a woman who had given herself permission to receive this, to allow it to be what it was, rather than managing it into something smaller and more manageable. She put her hand on Darnell's shoulder for a moment. She did not say anything. The hand said it. Agnes Whitfield arrived at 8, driving her truck with the cardboard still taped over the front window, which she had decided to leave in place until Monday, because she wanted the federal investigators to see it when they came, wanted it to be part of the record, wanted the record to include the fact that on the Friday before they arrived, someone had thrown a brick through the window of a 68-year-old woman's store in order to communicate that certain old women should mind their business. She came up the porch steps and greeted Joyce and Darnell and Delma, and then said she had brought the box. The box was in the truck bed, sealed with tape with Agnes's handwriting across the top, noting the contents in her precise, economical way. She said everything Herbert kept. Everything I found that he had not shown anyone, including the documentation on Judge Ogle. Joyce said the investigators are going to want to see all of it. Agnes said that is why I brought it. She set the box on the kitchen table inside, and then came back out to the porch and stood with the others and looked at the street. And the 4 of them stood there in the Georgia morning, while 412 motorcycles idled in the streets of Calhoun, and the neighbors gathered at the edges of the scene, and the town slowly understood that something had arrived in it that was not going away. Mayor Dennis Stoll did not appear that morning. He did not appear that afternoon. His town car was parked in the driveway of his house on the good side of Maple Street, visible from the road, and it did not move. Someone who worked in the municipal building told someone at the diner, who told Agnes that Stoll had arrived at the office at 7 that morning, 45 minutes before anyone else, and had been on the phone for 2 hours before his assistant came in, and that when his assistant had asked if he wanted coffee, he had said no in a way that had made her decide not to ask again. The federal injunction was served to the county courthouse at 10:15 Saturday morning by a process server who arrived in a rental car from Atlanta and who handed the documents to the clerk of court, with the efficiency of someone completing an errand, and left before 11. Judge Warren Ogle received a copy at his home. By noon, the word had moved through Calhoun the way words move through small towns. Not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously. The osmosis of a community where everyone had known everyone else long enough that information needed no specific vehicle, just proximity and time. By noon, people in Calhoun knew that a federal injunction had stopped Dennis Stoll from moving on any more properties that federal investigators were coming Monday. That the woman who ran the grocery store on the corner of Main and Calvary had documentation that her late husband had kept for years against this specific possibility. And they knew about the boy. They knew it the way they knew things that traveled fastest in small towns, which was the way things traveled when they carried both the factual content and the emotional content simultaneously, when the what and the how were equally striking and equally impossible to reduce to a summary that did justice to either. They knew that a 14-year-old boy who worked the delivery shift at Whitfield's General had gotten on a bus alone and gone to Atlanta and walked into an office and talked to lawyers for 2 hours, and that when he left, the lawyers had filed a federal injunction before the end of the business day. They knew his name. They had always known his name in the way that a town of 5,000 knew everyone's name, but they knew it differently now, with a quality of attention that was distinct from the ordinary familiarity of proximity. Darnell was not unaware of this. He was also not particularly moved by it, not in the way you might expect. Not with the self-consciousness of someone who understood that they had become notable. What he felt was closer to the feeling he had after fixing any broken thing, the quiet satisfaction of a task completed, and the readiness for whatever came next. The recognition, if it could be called that, was beside the point in the same way that the tip had been, beside the point when he offered it to Joyce on the sidewalk. He had done what needed doing. What came after the doing was its own thing, separate from the doing itself. Monday arrived. The federal investigators came in 2 cars, 4 people. The kind of federal presence that arrived with the gravity of institutional weight behind it. Not intimidating in any theatrical sense, but simply large in the way that certain things were large when they occupied a space, when the authority they represented was real and had history and precedent, and the full force of something that had been built over time to do exactly what it was now doing. Patricia Owens came with them. She and Darnell shook hands in the parking lot of Whitfield's General, which the investigators had chosen as a gathering point because it was central, and because the federal investigators who had been briefed by Owens understood that the store itself was part of the story, its broken window still boarded with cardboard in the late summer heat. Owens looked at the cardboard. She said to Darnell that stays as is until we have documented it. Do not fix it yet. He said Agnes figured you would say that. Owens almost smiled. The interviews happened over 2 days. The investigators worked methodically through a list of people and a list of documents moving between the conference room they had set up in the back of Whitfield's General and the county courthouse, and 2 private residences and the offices of Meridian Development Partners, which they had obtained access to through the injunction process. Agnes sat with them for 4 hours on the first day, going through Herbert's records 1 document at a time, explaining the accounting structure, the company filings, the pattern of transactions. She did it with the steady precision of a woman who had been organizing other people's finances since before most of the investigators in the room had been born, and she did not need the box to be opened in front of her to remember what was in it. Herbert had told her once, years before he got sick, that the most important thing a person could know was what they were responsible for, And the most important skill was keeping that responsibility organized. She had taken this seriously, and it showed. Darnell sat with the investigators for 2.5 hours on the second day. He brought his original map, the one on the graph paper, not the copies, but the original, because it felt right to bring the original, to bring the thing that was actually his, the record of his own year of watching and writing down. The lead investigator, a man named Garrett, who had been with the Department of Justice for 22 years, and whose face had the quality of someone who had heard a great many things in those 22 years and maintained his equilibrium throughout, looked at the map for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "You drew this over a year." Darnell said approximately. Garrett said without knowing why you were drawing it, just because you noticed the pattern. Darnell said I knew why I was drawing it. I just did not know what to do with it yet. Garrett looked at him. He said, "When you figured out what to do with it, you got on a bus." He said it as a statement, rather than a question, in the tone of someone confirming the details of a thing they still find slightly remarkable, even after being told it twice. Darnell said, "Yes, sir." Garrett set the map down carefully. He said, "I have been doing this work for over 2 decades. I want you to understand something. The gap between knowing something is wrong and taking it to the right place with the right documentation is where most cases fall apart. People know. They know and they do not know who to tell, or they tell the wrong person, or they do not have what they need to make it actionable. What you did assembling this, getting it to the legal defense fund that closed a gap that we could not close ourselves. We had a tip. We had no substance. You brought the substance." Darnell said Agnes's husband brought the substance. I just carried it. Garrett said you also built the map. That is yours. Darnell was quiet for a moment. He said there was a tip. 6 months ago, the Legal Defense Fund told me. Someone sent them a written communication about Stoll but could not substantiate it. Garrett said that is correct. It was part of what we were briefed on. Darnell said, "I think I know who sent it." Garrett looked at him. Darnell said there was a family. The first family on the list. The first one Stoll moved on. Their name was Odom. Lester Odom. He is my mother's cousin. He is family I have not seen since I was small. He left Calhoun 3 years ago when they lost the property, and I do not know where he went. But he was the first one this happened to, and he knew what was being done to him. And I think he looked for someone to tell, and found the Legal Defense Fund address, and sent them a letter and then left, because he did not think there was anything else he could do. Garrett was quiet. He said we can look into that. Darnell said if you find him, I would like to know. My mother would like to know. Garrett said I will see what I can do. The investigations continued through the week. Stoll was interviewed on Wednesday in the presence of his attorney in the conference room at Whitfield's General, which was a choice the investigators had made with the deliberateness of people who understood that geography was itself communicative. That conducting this interview in this room with Agnes's boarded window visible through the conference room door said something that no spoken statement needed to say. Stoll's attorney made objections. Stoll answered the questions he answered and declined to answer the questions. He declined in the manner of a man who had clearly spent the weekend with legal counsel and had arrived at a strategy that involved a great deal of cooperation in tone and a great deal of non-commitment in substance. He was still performing, still wearing the persona of the concerned civic leader, still using the register of a man who wanted you to know. that whatever difficulties might have arisen, his fundamental orientation toward the community was one of service and care. He performed it well. He had been performing it for a long time, but the documentation did not perform. The documentation simply was. The account records and the property filings and the acquisition records and the timeline that Herbert Whitfield had assembled in the months before he died, sitting alone in the back office of the house on Calvary Street, while his wife ran the store out front. The careful, organized record of what he had seen and what he had understood and what he had known needed to be preserved. That record did not adjust itself to the presence of Stoll's attorney, or Stoll's performance, or the way that Dennis Stoll had learned to occupy a room. Judge Warren Ogle resigned on Thursday. He sent a letter to the presiding judge of the circuit and then released a public statement that used the language of personal health and the desire to spend time with family, and contained no admission of anything which was the language of a man departing before departure was forced upon him, trying to shape the narrative of his own exit, while the narrative was still nominally his to shape. It was not actually his to shape. The Department of Justice opened a parallel criminal inquiry into Ogle on Friday. Stoll was formally suspended from his position as mayor the following Monday, 14 days after the morning that 412 motorcycles had filled the streets of Calhoun, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The deputy mayor, a woman named Ruth Perkins, who had been deputy mayor for 9 years, and who had a reputation for the kind of careful administrative competence that stayed out of the news, because it was doing its job correctly, assumed the duties of the office. Ruth Perkins's first act in an official capacity was to halt the structural assessment order that had been filed against the Odom property on Birch Street. Her second was to order a full review of all code enforcement actions taken in Holt County in the past 5 years. The formal charges against Dennis Stoll came 6 weeks later. Federal charges, not state charges filed by the Department of Justice under the Fair Housing Act and under federal fraud statutes. The indictment was 31 pages and named Stoll and 3 associates, and cited the full documentation that had been assembled from Herbert Whitfield's records from Meridian Development Partners files and from the account records of 7 families who had been displaced from their homes over 4 years. 7 families. The indictment named each of them. And on the morning the indictment was unsealed, a man arrived at the Odom house on Birch Street. He drove a truck that had seen considerable use with a Georgia plate that was not Holt County. And he parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a moment before he got out, as though he was making a decision, or had already made one, and was giving it a final moment before it became irreversible. He was in his 50s, broad through the chest, with a face that had been through weather, not just the weather of age, but the specific weather of difficulty of years that had not been easy, and had left their record on the skin and around the eyes, the way difficult years always did. His name was Lester Odom. Darnell was on the porch when the truck pulled up. He had been sitting on the porch with his school books, which had reasserted their presence in his life with the beginning of the new semester. And he had been doing the work with the same attention he brought to everything, while the other part of his mind remained with the things that had been happening in and around his town for the past several weeks. He looked at the man in the truck. He looked at his face. He thought about his mother and the things she had told him. The fragments of family history that came out sometimes in the way of small towns and extended families. The stories about people who had gone somewhere else. The names attached to places and events, and the occasional photograph. He knew who it was before the man opened the truck door. Lester Odom got out slowly. He stood beside his truck and looked at the house on Birch Street, and then at the boy on the porch. and something in his expression did the same thing. Agnes's expression had done when she looked at the map. That combination of grief and recognition, and something that was the feeling of a thing you had sent out into the world receiving an answer from a direction you had not anticipated. He said, "You are Delma's boy." Darnell said, "Yes, sir." Lester said, "You looked like your grandfather, the way you sit. That is exactly how your grandfather sat." Darnell had not known this. He had very few reference points for his grandfather, who had died before he was old enough to form memories. He said, "Come on up." Lester came up the porch steps, and they sat in the two chairs that faced the street. And for a moment, neither of them said anything because the moment was doing something that needed room and silence to do it properly. Then Lester said, "I sent a letter." Darnell said, "I know." Lester said, "I did not know what else to do. I had lost everything. The house, the property my father left me. I knew what Stahl was doing, but there was nobody in the county to tell. I found the Legal Defense Fund address in a library in Birmingham, and I wrote to them and told them what I knew. I did not have proof. I just had what I had seen. I figured maybe they could do something, or maybe they could not. I did not know." He looked at his hands. He said, "I did not know that 6 months later my cousin's boy was going to get on a bus to Atlanta with a folder that made my letter mean something." Darnell said, "It was not just me. It was Agnes. It was her husband who kept the records. It was Joyce Mack who was already heading toward this before any of us knew it." Lester said, "That is the way things work sometimes. A lot of people doing a lot of separate things and not knowing about each other until the pieces meet in the same place." He paused. He said, "I did not know you were going to be part of it. I did not know you had been watching. I did not know you had made a map." Darnell said, "I did not know the map was for anything in particular until Agnes put the folder on the table and the two things fit together." Lester looked at him. He said, "Your mama's still inside." Darnell said, "She is at work. She will be home at 6. Lester nodded. He looked at the street. The ordinary Saturday street, the same street that had been full of motorcycles not long ago, and would be full of them again. Joyce had told Darnell every year on this date for as long as the chapter was in a position to come. He said, "I want to be here when she gets home." Darnell said, "Yes, sir. I think you should be." They sat on the porch together through the afternoon, Lester and Darnell, and they talked the way people talked when they were making up for lost time, without quite saying that was what they were doing, in the way of people who had been pointed at each other by circumstances and were now following the direction those circumstances had indicated, tracing the line between where things had been and where they were now. Lester talked about his father's property, about the 40 years of it, the same land his father had worked, and his father's father before that. The relationship that certain people had to certain land that was not just economic, but something older and deeper than that. Something that had to do with knowing a place in full. The way you knew where the water sat after a heavy rain, and where the morning light came first, and where the soil went soft in the spring and hard in the summer. He talked about the notice, the day it came, the process that followed the inspector and the attorney, and the hearings that were not quite hearings, and the timeline that moved faster than he could respond to, and the moment when he understood that the outcome had been determined before the process began, and the process was simply the mechanism through which the predetermined outcome was formally achieved. He talked about leaving, the borrowed pickup, the furniture in it, his wife's face, the door standing open behind them, He said, "You leave a door open like that. Sometimes it means you think you are coming back. Sometimes it just means you are so done that closing it was one thing too many." He paused. He said, "I did not think I was coming back." Darnell listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with his full attention, not interrupting, letting the account arrive at its own pace. When Lester was finished, Darnell said, "The indictment is going to include your property. You are one of the 7 named families. The lawyers told my mother that there will be a civil remedy process as part of the resolution, that families who are displaced will have the opportunity to make claims for restitution." Lester looked at him. Darnell said, "I do not know exactly how it works, but Patricia Owens told me that getting the land back is possible, or at minimum compensation for its value. She said the civil process would run alongside the criminal case, and that the 7 families would each have standing to participate." Lester was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. He looked at the street. He looked at the house on Birch Street, the small brown house where his cousin's family had lived for 15 years. Then he said, "I thought I was coming to see Delma, to say I was sorry I did not do more, that I got out instead of fighting." Darnell said, "You sent the letter." Lester said, "That does not feel like enough." Darnell said it was the beginning. Every other thing that happened followed from it. You were the reason Joyce came to Calhoun. You were the reason she was on that road. You were the reason she stopped at that corner with a flat tire. He said it simply because it was simply true. The chain of it clear and traceable from one end to the other, from the letter a man had written in a library in Birmingham to a federal indictment 31 pages long. Lester looked at him. He said, "How old are you?" Darnell said 14. Lester said 14. He said it the same way several other people had said it in recent weeks, as a fact that required a moment of separate processing before it could be integrated into the rest of what was true. Delma came home at 6:12. She came up the walk in her factory clothes with her bag on her shoulder, and she was looking at her phone as she came through the gate, and she did not see Lester until she was almost at the porch steps, and when she looked up and saw him, she stopped. She stood on the walk and looked at her cousin. He stood up from the chair. They looked at each other for a moment, the way people looked at each other when the years between them were large enough that they had to do some work to find each other again, to locate the person they had known inside the person the years had made. Then Delma came up the steps, and Lester came down them, and they met in the middle, and she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there on the porch steps of the house on Birch Street in the early evening light. And Darnell picked up his books and went inside and let them have the porch. The trial of Dennis Stoll began 14 months later. It lasted 3 weeks. Patricia Owens was there. David Raines was there. Garrett from the Department of Justice was there. Agnes Whitfield was there, having driven herself in the truck, with the window now properly repaired, sitting in the gallery with the still attentiveness she brought to everything she considered important. Joyce Mack was there. She sat in the gallery with Wade Pruitt and Rusty Kane on either side of her. The 3 of them in the courtroom, in the way of people who did not ordinarily inhabit courtrooms, but had decided that this one was their business, and their presence in it was understood by everyone who saw them as exactly that: a statement of investment, a form of witness. Darnell testified. He was 15 now. Had been 15 for 3 months. He sat in the witness box in the same dark slacks and blue button shirt he had worn the morning Joyce Mack brought 200 motorcycles to Birch Street, because it seemed right, because those clothes had been the clothes of a morning that mattered, and this morning mattered. and there was a continuity in the wearing of them that felt true. He told the court about the map. He showed the map, the original on graph paper, now mounted on a foam board and enlarged so the jury could see the details. He walked through what each point represented, each address, each date, the line they formed, and what the line meant against the background of the highway routing that was now publicly known. He answered the questions the prosecutor asked, and the questions the defense attorney asked with the same directness he had brought to every conversation since this began, saying what he knew and not saying what he did not know, and making no attempt to be more or less than what he was, which was a boy who had watched his neighborhood carefully for a year and written down what he saw. The defense attorney asked him at one point whether he understood how unusual his involvement in this matter was. He said, "I fixed a flat tire. I noticed a pattern. I got on a bus." The attorney said, "And you do not consider that unusual?" He said, "I think most people can do those things. I think most people just do not." The jury was out for 2 days. They came back on a Tuesday morning. Darnell was in school when the verdict came. He was in Mr. Briggs's classroom, which he found appropriate, sitting in the same chair he had sat in when Mr. Briggs taught the class about the organizations that built the legal architecture for exactly this kind of fight. And his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he looked at the screen under the desk, the way students had been looking at phones under desks since phones were small enough to fit there. The text was from Patricia Owens. It said, "Guilty on all counts." He put his phone back in his pocket. He looked at the front of the room where Mr. Briggs was explaining something at the board, and he felt the news settle into him, the way the large things always settled into him quietly and permanently, finding their place in the architecture of what he knew and what he understood and what he had experienced and would carry forward. He waited until the end of class. He went to the hallway and called his mother. She answered on the first ring. He said, "Guilty on all counts." She was quiet. Then she said, "All of them." He said, "Yes, ma'am, all of them." She made a sound that was not quite a word. He knew the sound. It was the sound of something arriving that you had believed was coming but had not allowed yourself to fully believe in until the believing was no longer a risk. He said, "I have to get back to class." She said, "Yes, go to class." He went back to class. Judge Warren Ogle pleaded guilty to federal corruption charges 5 weeks before his own trial was scheduled to begin, in the manner of men who have spent their lives with a sophisticated understanding of legal proceedings and understand when the accounting finally arrives exactly how it is going to go, and prefer to manage the terms of their own surrender rather than have the terms managed for them. The plea agreement required his cooperation with ongoing investigations into related conduct in 2 other counties. The civil remedy process that Patricia Owens had described to Darnell moved forward alongside the criminal proceedings. It was slower, as civil processes were slower, but it moved. 6 of the 7 displaced families filed claims. Lester Odom filed his. 18 months after the guilty verdict, Lester Odom drove back to Holt County. He drove back in a different truck. Newer one he had been able to afford with part of the settlement from the civil claim. He drove to the property his father had left him, and he walked it, the way you walked. Land you had known your whole life, and had been away from long enough that you needed to relearn its character, its seasonal moods, the way the light moved across it in the afternoon, and the way the water sat after rain. He called Delma from the property line. He said, "I am standing on it." She said, "I know. I can hear it in your voice. He built a house on it. It was a modest house, the kind a man built when what he wanted was not a statement, but a home. and he built it with the help of people from the town who came because they wanted to come the generosity of a community that has been through something together and is in the process of learning what it means to be through it. Darnell helped on the weekends. He drove out with his mother on Saturday mornings and worked through the afternoon learning what he did not know and doing what he did know and discovering that building a thing with your hands had a quality in common with fixing a thing with your hands. The same feedback loop of effort and response. The same satisfaction of a thing that needed doing getting done. Agnes Whitfield repaired the window at Whitfield's General 3 weeks after the verdict. She had kept it boarded for 14 months through the trial, through the sentencing, through the civil proceedings, with the intention she had stated from the beginning that it would be part of the record for as long as the record was being made. When the record was sufficiently made, she had a glazier from Dalton come down and put in a new pane better than the old one, with a low-E coating that kept the summer heat out more effectively than its predecessor. She stood on the sidewalk outside when the glazier finished and looked at the new window. Then she went inside and stood at the counter and looked at the clean glass from the interior and thought about Herbert the way she thought about Herbert most days. Not with the acute grief of the early months, but with the settled, ongoing sense of someone whose absence had become part of the daily texture, of things present in the form of the things he had left behind the store, and the files, and the careful, organized record of what he had known, and what he had believed someone would come for. Someone had come. Joyce Mack came back to Calhoun the following summer. She came alone without the chapter, just the bike and herself. And she came on a Tuesday afternoon in July when the heat was the oppressive presence that July in Georgia required it to be. And the streets had the slightly stunned quality of streets in that kind of heat. She came to Whitfield's General first. Agnes made coffee, and they sat at the counter and talked for a while in the way of two women who had been through something together and had arrived at a relationship that had its own character, its own ease. The ease of people who did not need to explain themselves to each other, because the explaining had already been done in the doing. Then Joyce went to the house on Birch Street. Darnell was on the porch with his school books. He was 16 now, and the books had gotten heavier in both the literal and figurative sense. The content more demanding, the work more sustained, the intensity of a student who had decided what he was working toward and had organized his effort accordingly. He looked up when Joyce came through the gate. She came up the porch steps and sat in the second chair and looked at the street. She said, "I heard from the chapter president. We are going to make the summer run to Calhoun an annual thing. Establish it as part of the chapter's calendar. He wants to call it the Whitfield Run. For Agnes's husband." Darnell said Agnes is going to have feelings about that. Joyce said Agnes has feelings about everything. That is one of the things I respect about her. They were quiet for a moment. Then Darnell said, "I have been thinking about what I want to study." Joyce said, "Tell me." He said, "Civil rights law. The infrastructure of it. The organizations that do what the Legal Defense Fund does, the ones that exist to take the kind of evidence that Herbert Whitfield kept and move it to where it can do something. I want to know how those systems work from the inside. How to build them and maintain them and use them correctly." Joyce looked at him. She said, "Law school is a long road." He said, "I know. I have looked at what is required. The undergraduate degree first, then the law program. I am looking at University of Georgia. They have a good civil rights clinic." She said, "You have done the research." He said, "I do research." The smallest version of a smile crossed her face and was gone. She said, "You will be good at it, for what it is worth coming from me." He said it is worth something. Yes, ma am. She sat with him on the porch for another hour, and they talked about other things. Ordinary things, the town and the heat, and the way things had shifted in Calhoun in the year since the verdict. The quality of a community that has been through a reckoning and is in the process of deciding what to do with what it now knows about itself. Some things were better. Some things were more complicated than they had been. Most things were both simultaneously. When she stood to go, she put her hand on his shoulder the way she had done once before, on a morning that felt simultaneously very close and very distant. And she looked at him for a moment with those pale eyes. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He understood what the look contained. He had understood it the first time she gave it to him, standing on the porch of this house with the sound of 1,000 engines fading down Birch Street. He understood it better now. It was the look of someone who had found what they were looking for without knowing they were looking for it, and had decided that the finding was its own sufficient statement, that nothing needed to be added to it. She went down the porch steps. She got on her bike. The engine came alive, and she pulled out into Birch Street and moved down it toward the end of the block. And Darnell sat in his chair on the porch and watched her go, and listened to the sound of the engine recede and then fade into the ordinary noise of the afternoon, the birds and the heat, and the town going about its business. He picked up his book. He went back to work. 12 years later, Darnell Odom sat in a different chair in a different city, in the offices of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Atlanta, which was not the same room where he had sat at 14 with a folder in his backpack and 2.5 hours of bus ride behind him, but was in the same building on the same floor and had the same quality of light from the windows that faced the city to the west. He was 26 years old, and he was in his 4th year at the University of Georgia School of Law, concentrating in civil rights litigation. And he was in Atlanta for a practicum placement that would last the semester, working alongside the attorneys who did the work. He had decided 12 years ago he wanted to understand from the inside. David Raines was still there. He had become a senior attorney in the years between, and he had a different office now, bigger with more files and a whiteboard covered in the dense, organized notation that accumulated when someone had been working on something complex for a long time. He had shaken Darnell's hand on the first day of the practicum with the same quality of handshake he had offered a 14-year-old boy, no adjustment for age-full recognition. He had said, "I wondered if you would come back." Darnell had said, "I always plan to." Raines had said, "I know. Patricia told me. She said you were going to be a lawyer before you left the building the first time." On the wall of the conference room where the practicum students worked, there was a framed copy of the Holt County indictment, 1 page of it, the first page with the case number and the date and the names of the defendants and the charges. Raines had told him it had been put there 3 years ago by one of the partners who had been involved in the case from the beginning, as an example of what was possible when documentation was assembled correctly and taken to the right place. Darnell looked at it sometimes when he was in the conference room. He thought about Herbert Whitfield sitting in the back office of a house on Calvary Street in Calhoun, Georgia, assembling a record he believed someone would come for. He thought about a man writing a letter in a library in Birmingham and not knowing where it would go. He thought about a woman on a motorcycle with a flat tire on a Tuesday morning, and a boy who stopped because the tire needed fixing and it was in his nature to fix things that needed fixing. He thought about the map on graph paper, 12 months of observations folded and unfolded, until the paper had worn soft at the creases, the addresses and dates that had looked like separate things until they looked like one thing, until the line they made became visible. He thought about a bus at 7:45 in the morning, and the way Atlanta had appeared on the horizon first as a thickening of the air, and then as a gathering of steel and glass, and the feeling of walking into a building with something important in your backpack, and knowing that you had done every part of what was yours to do, and now needed to trust the parts that were not yours to the people who knew how to handle them. He was still learning the parts that were his. He expected he would be learning them for a long time, which was fine, which was the correct relationship to have with work that mattered. The understanding that you came to it continually, that there was always more to know, always a better way to do it, always another person in another town who had spent a year watching and writing things down and needed someone to show them where to take it. He had a photograph on his desk. He had taken it himself on his phone the summer after the verdict, the Saturday morning when Joyce Mack brought the chapter to Calhoun for the first Whitfield run. The photograph showed the corner of Main and Calvary Whitfield's General, visible in the background, with its new window catching the morning light. And in the foreground, leaning against the counter that ran along the front of the store, Agnes Whitfield and Joyce Mack, and Lester Odom and Delma Odom, the four of them in a configuration of people who did not usually occupy the same frame, but have arrived there through the specific logic of events that no one planned and everyone shaped. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking at something down the street, something the photograph did not show. And their faces had the expression of people watching something approach that they have been waiting for. Darnell knew what they were watching. He had been watching it too from behind the camera. The long column of motorcycles coming around the corner from the south end of Calvary Chrome in the morning sun. Engines filling the air with the sound that Calhoun had learned over the past year to associate not with danger but with witness, not with threat, but with the quality of presence that announced itself before it arrived and remained in the air for a while after it was gone. He kept the photograph on his desk because it was accurate, not just as a record of a moment, but as a record of a truth. The truth that things moved in directions that were not predictable from any single point. Within them that the line between one act and its consequences was longer and more circuitous than it appeared at either end. That a person doing the small available thing, the thing that was theirs to do without calculating what it would return, was sometimes the beginning of something whose shape would not be visible for years. He had fixed a tire. He had noticed a pattern. He had gotten on a bus. The rest had been the rest, each thing following from the thing before it, in the way that things followed when the original act was a true one, undiluted by calculation or self-interest. Simply a thing done because it needed doing by someone who happened to be there and happened to be the kind of person who stopped. He went back to work, outside the windows of the Legal Defense Fund. Atlanta moved through its morning, the city doing what cities did, indifferent and alive and full of people who were each of them at the center of a story whose shape they could not yet see. Carrying things they did not know they were carrying toward places they had not yet imagined. He opened his files. The next case was waiting.